Hey, psst, I have a website. The link is below the video. It is called portraitartacademy.com. You should click on it. Okay, back to the video.
Okay, we're going to talk about creating the foreground and background. So the foreground, there's also a middle ground and a background. The layers of distance create a sense of depth. That's why they need to be separate, and it needs to be obvious that they are separate. If you don't do this, then it's like they all blend in with each other, and we don't want that. Definitions, here's the background and the foreground, which are almost in every image, but sometimes though there is a middle ground as well. Not every image has a middle ground. Light and dark. Now, the background is usually lighter than the foreground. This is one way to allow viewers to focus on the foreground more. Sometimes there's an exception to this. Sometimes the foreground is a silhouette. This makes it mysterious. A silhouette is usually completely dark or black in a certain shape. The shape is visible, but the details aren't. Now, maybe you can see some details in here, but not a lot. And so it just kind of makes you wonder what his face looks like, what all the details do look like. A background creates a sense of size. A person in the foreground may appear bigger, but it still shows how tiny the character is in the enormous landscape in this case. Now, look, this guy, if you would have put him here, he would have been just a little speck, right? So it does appear that he's bigger, but you can still see like how small he is compared to this whole landscape, and that's what creates that sense of size. Blurring in the background is a common technique used to sometimes it makes sense to blur the background so that the focal point is in the foreground. More details mean that it's more likely that the viewer will focus on it. So because there's like way more details in here, you tend to look at it more carefully. You don't really care about these blurry these blurry blobs in the back because it's just blurred out too much, so it doesn't really attract attention. Blurring the foreground is occasionally, but it's less common. The foreground is blurred to make something in the middle ground or background stand out. And in this case, it's because this girl should be the center of attention, and so these flowers are just kind of in the way. And I guess the photographer was like, okay, I can't really get rid of these flowers, they're just in the way, but let's just blur them, and then still the focus is mostly on this, because who's going to focus on this even though it's in the foreground? It's just all blurry. Different colors. Sometimes it helps to have a completely different color in the foreground than in the background. A cool color contrasted with a warm color can be an example, like in here. So instead of using dark and light, you use the power of color to create depth. So we saw before that a lot of times dark in the foreground is used and light in the background to create a contrast and a sense of depth and foreground and background. But what you can also do to separate the two, just to make something stand out, like in this case, this is a very warm color, all this purple, reddish, magenta, whatever, and so this is just all blue and dark blue, light blue, that kind of stuff. So it really makes this person in the foreground pop. Even if you squint your eyes, you can easily see it. Now, a focus can also sometimes be on the background. At times, the focus is completely on the background, but the foreground serves as a contrast. Sometimes it's just a silhouette to create the difference between light and dark, or colorful and not very colorful. So in this case, you can see that this is really the center of attention. Now, this may attract some attention too, but it's just a silhouette. You don't really know what else there is. It's just a shape. It's important to give you a sense of how gigantic all of this is, but really all the patterns and all of this is really where the focus goes. So this just serves as something that gives you a sense of perspective and a sense of size, and other than that, it really doesn't serve much of a purpose. It's all about the background here. Now, sometimes light and dark lines, the darkness of the lines and the hue of the colors, so how brightly, how the hue, do you know what the hue is? The hue is how strong the color is. So if it's very grayish, it's not a strong hue. But if the color is just really popping, like it's really in that spectrum that it's got a lot of color, then the hue is very strong. It can create another contrast between the foreground and background. Typically, the foreground has darker lines and shadows. This image is a perfect example of a piece of art that was done by an artist who understood the important separation between foreground and background. Now look at all this stuff in the foreground. This is the foreground, but this, what is it, a girl and just a pot of paint, it seems, and a lemonade is not so strongly emphasized, but all of these lines are very dark. There's a lot of black, and then the hue is stronger too. So it's like really red, just bright red, and this green. And then the same thing with this. Apparently they wanted this in the foreground or middle ground as well. But everything else in the background has like the black lines are not black; they're gray, and so everything else is a little lighter. And even this reddish color, that's not really red, it's just subdued, and it's more grayish and lighter. So it's really, I really like this image, it's really great.